Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening on Digging Your Bible Presents Ask the Archaeologist. We are on episode 20. Imagine that. We are on episode 20 of Ask the Archaeologist. I'm so glad that you could be with us this evening to learn more about everything that the Lord just has to show us within the pages of the Bible. So before we get into our program for this evening, let's go ahead and bow our heads for a word of prayer. Dear Lord, please be with us as we investigate your word and learn more about the wonderful things that you have done and that you are going to do. Please be with us throughout the rest of the week. In your name we pray, amen. So glad that you could join us for this evening. We actually, tonight, for our live program, we will be taking questions, but we actually only have one question, and this is kind of just a summary of the question that was asked. It came up over the course of the past week in a comment that was made about a program that we had had in the past about the Ark of the Covenant and the time from when the Ark of the Covenant was taken from Shiloh to Jerusalem. And I just want to touch on that because if one person has a question about it, there's certain to be other ones. And I want everybody to be on the same page of where we're coming from when we say that there is a 20-year difference here. So let's just dive in. So thank you, SR, for submitting the question and bringing this to our attention. And let's dive in. So basically, the summary was that the Ark of the Covenant spent longer than 20 years in Kirjathjearim. So that was the statement that SR made. And we're going to look back at the Ark's movements to come to a conclusion on exactly how long the ark was in specific locations, where the ark was, and we're just going to follow the Bible and scripture and see where that lands us for this evening. So, the first thing we're going to look at is a timeline because I find timelines very, very helpful when we're trying to track something. So, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to see where the Ark of the Covenant went after the Israelites left the wilderness. The next place that we can track it is it being located in Shiloh. And we're going to look at some of these verses in more detail later on. So this is kind of just a brief summary before we get into the main portion. So we have the ark. We know that in 1 Samuel 4:4, it's in Shiloh. Then we have it being removed from Shiloh by the sons of Eli. And when they remove it, it's then captured by the Philistines, where it resides in the Philistine land. Then it is returned to the Israelites to a place called Bethshemesh. Then it is placed at a location that is called Kirjathjearim. And from there, it's taken and it's placed in the household of Obededom. And finally, it makes its way to its location in Jerusalem, where it stays for a very long time. So now that we've given a brief overview of the Ark of the Covenant's movements, let's look at some of these verses, these supporting details, in a little bit further inspection. So when the people sent to Shiloh that they might bring from thence the Ark of the Covenant, so this is telling us that the Ark of the Covenant was residing in Shiloh. This is still the wilderness tabernacle sanctuary where they had brought it from those 40 years of wandering. They set up the tent at Shiloh, and if you were with us or you watched last week's presentation, we actually covered a little bit about the archaeology that's currently ongoing and has been ongoing at Shiloh and some of the different things that they have found there. But the people send to Shiloh for the Ark of the Covenant, but then we see something where the sons of Eli, who are Hophni and Phinehas, they take the Ark and they go out to the field of battle, and they think that, hey, we have the Ark of the Covenant. Nothing's going to happen to us now. We are going to win. But they forgot something. The ark itself has no power. The power is with God, and God being with the Ark of the Covenant. And they forgot to ask for God's blessing and what God wanted to be done with this. And so when they get to the field of battle, what ends up happening is the sons of Eli are slain, and the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, which is not a good thing. Your seat of your God, where your Lord sits, where you can go to him and you can ask, and the whole sanctuary service revolves around the Ark of the Covenant, because that is where God's presence on earth resides. It is now taken from the Israelites, and it is given to the Philistines. And the Philistines actually have more respect for it, because they take it to the house of their God. So they just didn't toss it aside. They didn't melt it down for the gold. They gave it a place of honor in the tabernacle of their God. But God wanted to prove a point to them that their gods were false and that he was the only true God. So this is where we have the story in the Bible of Dagon, where they placed it in the house of Dagon, or the temple of Dagon. They come back in the next morning. Dagon is on the ground before the Ark of the Covenant. They put the statue back up. They come back in the next day, and Dagon's in pieces. But that's not the only thing that happens. Whichever city of the Philistines that the ark resides in, they start having terrible, terrible plagues. And so they send it to the next city, and the same thing happens. And for 7 months, these plagues are going around the lands of the Philistines and their cities, and they're like, what do we do? So finally, based upon their standards of giving offerings and, hey, what do we do with this thing? We know that there is some sort of higher power that is involved here. So they make an offering. They make little golden offerings, and they place them on a cart, and then they take oxen and they put the oxen on the cart and they send it towards the Israelites, because they're like, we don't want this trouble. Let's send it back to them. Maybe it will stop the trouble for us and give them some trouble. So the Ark of the Covenant goes back to the land of the Israelites after 7 months of being in the territory of the Philistines. So when it gets back to the land of the Israelites, it goes to this place that is called Bethshemesh. And the people there see it coming. They place it on a great stone. It's called the Great Stone of Abel. It's rumored to have been potentially a former altar site. We don't really know who this Abel is. The reason that this great stone was known when the book of Samuel is being written, and I'm using the general term of Samuel to cover both 1st and 2nd Samuel, and you will hear me do the same thing with the book of Kings and Chronicles. But getting back to this Stone of Abel, we don't know particularly why it was important, but at the time that the book of Samuel is being written, this stone was still in existence. They're telling you, hey, this stone is still here. You can go see it. You can go see where the Ark of God resided. But instead of being respectful of the Ark of the Covenant and following the rules that they clearly knew and understood, the people decided that they were going to open it up and take a peek inside. And there ended up being a plague within the town and the surrounding area, because all of these people decided that they were going to disrespect God and do what they knew they were not supposed to do, and open it up and take a peek inside and see what was there. So the people of Bethshemesh are like, hey, this is not a good thing. We don't need this. So they sent messengers to this place called Kirjathjearim, and they said, come get this. So they contacted a priest who lived there, or not necessarily a priest, but a Levite. Abinadab was a Levite. And they sent to his house. They take it back to Abinadab's house, and Abinadab sets his son Eleazar to keep the ark. That word also translates as guard it or care for it. So Abinadab has his son Eleazar, who is keeping this ark, guarding it, caring for it, making sure that nothing happens to it. And when we are looking at 1 Samuel 6:21 through the end of the chapter, and then the first two verses of Samuel 7, so 1 Samuel 7, verses 1 and 2, we read that the ark was in Kirjathjearim for 20 years. Now, this is very important, and we're going to come back to this because this is where the question arises. So far, we know that it was taken into the field of battle from Shiloh. From the field of battle, it was taken to the Philistines' land. We don't know how long the battle was, but it does not appear to have been a very long battle. For 7 months, it is in the land of the Philistines. It's in their cities. After that 7 months, it is now taken back to the land of Israel, where it does not stay very long in Bethshemesh, and it ends up at the home of Abinadab, where it stays for 20 years. At the end of that 20 years, David comes along, and David's like, you know what? We really need the ark in the city of David. We need it in Jerusalem, our capital. So he goes, he gets it, they put it on a cart, which they were not supposed to do. And along the way, Uzzah, who is Abinadab's son, and his brother had been commanded to keep and guard the ark. But Uzzah decides that he is going to place his hand against the ark to keep it from falling, which was strictly prohibited. He knew better. He had been with this ark for 20 years. He knew all of the rules and regulations around it, and he went ahead and he chose disobedience, and everything just halts. David's like, okay, I don't want to keep going. I don't want to stop. I really don't know what to do. So they decide that, hey, there's this guy called Obededom who is right here. They put it in his house, and it resides in his house for 3 months. And during that 3 months, that house got so blessed that David is sitting there like, okay, time out. We need those blessings in our capital city, not just with the house of Obededom. So then they research, they do it correctly this time, and finally bring it back into the house in Jerusalem. And we know this from 2 Chronicles 1:4 that it ends up in Jerusalem in a tent, because at this time, remember, Solomon's temple has not yet been built. So it is placed in a tent that was especially set up for it in Jerusalem. We do not know whether or not the rest of the sanctuary tabernacle furniture is moved to Jerusalem at this time, but we do know that this is where the Ark of the Covenant was residing. Now, if we are trying to track this through the Bible, we have to know all the names for this particular city, because cities in the Bible, they all have a variety of names. So if we're looking at, say, Hebron, Hebron is also listed as Arba or Kirjath Arba. When we're looking at the city of Kirjathjearim, there are a variety of spellings for the name. So we have an I in place of one of the J's, but it's also called Kirjath Baal or Bala or Bala, whichever way that you prefer to say it. It's also referred to as Gibeah. Now, there is a town called Gibeah, and there's also the land of Gibeah, kind of like a region, county sort of thing, where there's multiple cities within a region that is known as Gibeah. And it kind of remains unclear about which particular one. Based upon all of the research that I've done, I'm leaning more towards being in the land of Gibeah. We can compare this when we are looking at 2 Samuel compared to 1 Chronicles, where the one is called Gibeah and the other location is called Bala and Kirjathjearim. It's all in the same sentence. So when we are looking at Joshua 15:9 and 1 Chronicles 13:6 and 2 Samuel 6:3-4, we can tell that this city has at least 3 different names, potentially 4 or 5, that we are going to have to go through and be able to track so that we know exactly what is going on. But when we compare, we can put together the timeline and we know, okay, this is where the ark was, here's how long it stayed, and it gives us a much larger picture. So if you want to make notes and go back and do research for yourself, this might be a good place to pause or go back and reference after the program so that you can grab these verses so that you can do additional research. Now, what's interesting is when David decides to bring this ark to Jerusalem, one of the reasons that he is bringing it there is because he says, "For we inquired not at it in the days of Saul." We can read about this in 1 Chronicles 13, verse 3. So David is talking with his advisors, and they make this statement, which leads to the conclusion that during Saul's entire reign, they did not go to the Ark of the Covenant. They didn't take it into battle. They didn't do anything with it. They just let it sit there in the house of Abinadab for the past, according to what we just read, 20 years. And so this gives us an idea of the duration of the rule of King Saul. Because if Saul had ruled for 40 years and the ark wasn't consulted and it wasn't moved, we don't read about the Ark of the Covenant being there when David fights Goliath. They obviously had no hope when Goliath is there. If the Ark of the Covenant had been there, they may have had a little bit more hope than sending David out with a sling to slay the giant. But if Saul had reigned for a much longer time period, why wouldn't it say that in the verse that we just read previously? But this also gives us an idea because when we are looking at King David and when he says this when he captures Jerusalem, which used to be called the city of Jebus. So when he captures Jerusalem, how old was he? When we look at the reign of King David, if you go to 2 Samuel 5, verses 4-5, it says that he began to reign when he was 30 years old, but he didn't start his rule in Jerusalem. He actually started in Hebron, and this was after King Saul had died. So King Saul dies, and that's when David says, okay, I'll be king now. And he goes to Hebron, where he rules for 7.5 years. And after that 7.5 years, he captures Jebus, which is renamed Jerusalem, or the city of David, and he reigns there for 33 years. So in total, he is given a reign of 40 years, which is actually probably closer to like 40.5 years. But we know that David was king for 7.5 years before he ever captured Jerusalem. That means that the events that are taking place in that chapter 6 could not have taken place prior to David becoming king, which means that if David was king at 30 and it's 7.5 years later, he is at least 37.5 years old when he first tries to bring the ark to Jerusalem. That's if he captures Jerusalem and the first thing he says is, hey, let's bring the ark here. If he waited at all, that means that he's older than 37.5. But at minimum, at the very, very least, David is 37.5 years old when he decides to bring the ark to the city of David. That gives us some information about the Ark of the Covenant, because when we are looking, it's been at the house of Abinadab for 20 years, and prior to that, it was 7 months with the Philistines. So if we take David at 37.5 and we go back 20 years, then he was 17.5 when the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the house of Abinadab, which means that if we go back 7 months, David is at minimum around 16 and a half, 16 and 3/4 when the ark was taken from Shiloh and Eli died. And then if the people waited at all for the ark's return to demand a king, and we know that Saul ruled for 2 years, 2 full years before he failed. You can see this indicated in 1 Samuel 13:1. Then David is somewhere around 19 and a half to 20 years old when he's anointed by Samuel, which means that, yes, David was alive during the time of Eli and Eli's sons. He actually was getting firsthand reports coming from the ark being taken, because the verse that says, hey, the Ark of the Covenant it went from the Philistines pretty much directly to Kirjathjearim, maybe a couple of weeks in between there, long enough for them to send word and say, come get this thing before we all die, because we don't know how to respect it. And it stayed at the house of Abinadab for 20 years. And if David didn't bring it back until he was 37 and a half, minus 20 gives us 17 and a half for when it first went to the house of Abinadab. And I apologize for those that don't like math. This is very much a math-focused presentation with all of the numbers that we're doing. And some people will say, well, but what about Saul? We know that Saul ruled for 40 years, and we know this because of 1 Samuel 13:1. Well, this is where Bible versions come into play, because some versions say that Saul ruled for 40 years and 42 years. And other versions just say that when Saul had reigned 1 year, he then reigned a second year, and certain events occurred during that second year of rule. When you actually go to the original Hebrew for these verses in 1 Samuel, it does not tell you how long Saul ruled. That 40 years has been added in afterwards. And it was added in because of some traditions and because of a particular verse in Acts, which we're going to get to in a moment. But they've added this in. This is why it's really important to kind of research and also be careful of which versions. I prefer a particular version, but I do not use that version exclusively. I like to look at all versions. I like to go back through and see what these words mean in Hebrew. What was the original writing? What scrolls and fragments have been found that can confirm this? I don't believe that there's just one particular version that must be used over all others. I do prefer a specific version, but this is why version choice can be very difficult when you're trying to, say, do a group study and you're all using different versions. This is also where I like to use a parallel Bible and look at all of the verses in a line, because some versions maybe write it a little differently and make it a little easier to understand in certain things. There are certain verses that do become much clearer. But you've got to go back and you've got to check, was this something that was added? If I don't see this in another version and I'm seeing it in this version, why is there that type of difference? And that's where, when we're looking at the reign of King Saul, nowhere in the Hebrew does it actually tell us how old Saul was when he became king, nor does it say how old Saul was when he, or how many years that Saul ruled as a king. Now, there is a tradition because of 1 Samuel 9:2, where it says that there was a choice young man. The phrase there is actually, it's using, some places say the same word, some places say that it is a word that is very similar and a variation of a specific word, kind of like when you're using a thesaurus. But it's a redundancy. And when it's a redundancy, that means not that Saul was a young man when he was chosen as king, but that he was a very comely, well-grown man, that he was at the prime of his life, and that there are estimates that he was somewhere around the age of 40 to 45, which this is actually where the potential reign of 42 years actually starts to make sense of maybe being snuck in over the 1,000+ years from when King Saul actually ruled to the New Testament time frame, because they're getting the age that he may have been when he started to rule, such as maybe 42, mixed up with how many years he actually ruled. But there's nowhere in Scripture where it actually tells us how old he was when he began to rule. Now, there is a place in Acts 13:18 through 21. And this is where it becomes a little difficult, because when we are looking at this speech that Paul gives, it's like, oh, well, it's right here. We know exactly how long he ruled. And I'm going to read this speech that Paul is giving, and then we're going to talk about it. So in Acts 13:18 through 21, it says, "And about the time of 40 years suffered he their manners in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed the 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he divided their land to them by lot. And after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet. And afterward they desired a king, and God gave unto them Saul, the son of Cis, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. Now, it seems like, okay, here we know that Saul was king for 40 years, but there is a issue that we're going to talk about. One is this about. This word about is not an exact, this is an estimate. If we look at this time frame, it is an approximate, not an exact, and the commentators and the translators all disagree on exactly what Paul meant in this verse, because if it's taken literally, this extends well beyond the time frame that is given in 1 Kings 6:1. So if you look at 1 Kings 6:1, 1 Kings 6:1 says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt," in other words, the Exodus, "in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph," which is the 2nd month, "that he began to build the house of the Lord." So according to 1 Kings 6:1, the temple, Solomon's temple, was begun 480 years from the Exodus to when it started, the foundations were laid. But if we take Paul's speech as exact, he says that it was 40 years in the wilderness, 450 years of judges, an undetermined amount of time for Samuel, which is often given as 40 years. But again, just like Saul, there is no scriptural basis for that 40 years. It's just, hey, we think it was. Plus then the 40 years of King Saul until King David, and then the 40 years of King David as king. So you take 40 plus the 450 plus the 40 for Samuel plus the 40 for Saul, and then we have the 40 for King David. That gives us a total of 610 years. This is a minimum of 130 years over the amount of time that was provided by the scribes of the book of Kings. So we have an issue here because the Bible can't contradict itself. So in one place, we've got a timetable of at least, if we don't even include if we don't even include the prophet Samuel for 40 years, we're talking 570 years. So we're talking well over the 480 that is clearly written in 1 Kings 6:1. So there are some commentators that indicate that the verses in Acts actually indicate the total duration of both Samuel and Saul's rule as being a combination of 40 years when you're actually looking at the Greek. Some suggest that Paul was actually breaking down parts of an approximate 450-year time frame. If you look at Ellicott's and Barnes' commentaries, it suggests that the 450 was not the duration of the judges, but was actually the time frame from Isaac's birth to the death of Joshua when the judges began to rule. But all of these, nobody can actually figure out where Paul is coming from because it doesn't make sense based on what we have that was provided in the Old Testament. Now, when we're looking at Josephus lived somewhere around 37 BC to 100 AD. Some people say that should be 37 AD, but we're just going to cover a much larger time frame. He was somewhere within the life of Christ and the apostles. And he attributes the duration between the Exodus to the construction of the temple as 592 years. And at the same time, he's living during the time of Paul. Josephus was schooled in all the books and traditions of the Jews, like the Midrash, all of the oral traditions. He was familiar with the LXX. He had the Hebrew scrolls. He was very well learned for his time, but his writings are not 100% accurate. He didn't even get facts about kings and governors that ruled right during his time frame correct. He is self-contradictory in places. His writings are more traditional. They lean towards a more Hellenistic approach. The ages end up being extended. Measurements are decreased. We see him use more of the mythology, but this is not exclusive to Josephus. This is something that a lot of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and some of the scribes were doing. It was very common in that time frame. And when we're looking at Paul, who is the person that is giving this oration to the crowd, we're seeing some of this same thing. You know, Paul was trained to be a Pharisee. He actually used this training as a Pharisee, knowing what the Sadducees taught, and he used that to pit them off against one another so that he could actually get his message across. But we know that because he was trained as a Pharisee, he was indoctrinated with all of the traditional histories, regardless of the accuracy of these timelines and all of the claims. So you had all of these additional writings that were being presented to the people that were a mix of truths that were maybe slightly exaggerated, that were flat out contradictory to what the scrolls. These became points of contention because the Pharisees and scribes were saying, hey, you know, these followers of Christ are uneducated and they can't know what they're talking about. And Christ keeps pointing the people back to the word of the prophets rather than the scrolls and the teachings of men. And we can read about this in Matthew 15:8-9, and in Mark 7:5 and 13, and in Luke 24:44. Christ keeps directing them back. He's like, I don't care what, so-and-so's teachers, professors, first cousins, brothers, second wife said. I want you to go back to the actual scrolls that were inspired. What is actually written in the law of Moses? What did the prophets and the Psalms say? If we read in Luke, it was specifically, in this case, about the writings that concerned Jesus' coming, but he was directing the people back to the original scrolls. He's saying, these are what you need to look at. These are the accepted, these are the truth. All of these other things, they might be fine and great to look at, but that doesn't mean that they are true. That doesn't mean that this is what you should be basing your doctrine on. When you are looking at scripture and you're basing things off of some fallacies, if there's a discrepancy, what shall you follow? Shall you follow the writings of the men, or shall you follow the writings of the prophets and the laws? And if you go to Deuteronomy 19:15, it says that out of the mouth of two witnesses or three witnesses shall a matter be established. So when we are looking at the writings of the Kings and the Chronicles and Samuel and Judges and Exodus, and we're comparing the timelines because it provides very detailed information about all of the kings and who ruled when and how long the Philistines ruled and how long this individual ruled. When you actually start laying those down and looking at them, we are not getting a timeline of 600 plus years. We are actually getting a timeline that matches what First King says of, hey, this is 480 years, and here's all of the things that lead us to believe this. Was Paul wrong? Does that mean that we can't then listen to Paul because Paul said, hey, this king ruled for 40 years and this king ruled for X amount of time? No, that doesn't mean that Paul was wrong. Paul is just simply telling the people either what he believed, what he had been trained to believe, or he's telling the people, okay, you know what? This might not be correct, but you're not ready to hear this particular bit of information because over the past 1,000 years since this event occurred, a lot of things have changed and been corrupted. You're not ready to hear the actual truth yet. This isn't a matter of your salvation, so we're just going to roll with it and we'll correct this later. Because there are certain cases where we know that God does wink at our ignorance, and if you are studying, and he will keep opening your eyes and as you are ready to digest this. So it could have been a situation like that, or it just could have been a situation where, it's been ingrained in your brain so much and so often that you simply don't even think about it. And okay, King Saul ruled for 42 years. It's been told and told and told so many times that you don't even realize that, hey, that's tradition, that's actually not truth. And there's things in today's world where, you might have been told something about the Bible or about religion so many times that you don't even realize it's not in Scripture. And therefore, you're completely unaware that that is just tradition. And God winks at that. But when we have evidence such as what we read in 1 Kings 6:1, and then we can go back and we can verify that by tracking the movements of the Ark of the Covenant, because we always got to go back to God. Let's track God's seat. And when we track God's seat, we compare that with the building of the house of God. And then you compare that with some of the writings in Judges. We have our 2 or 3 witnesses where the matter is established. And so that is where we can come up with this timeline of David actually being alive during the time of the high priest Eli, of witnessing a lot of these events, the rise and fall of King Saul, as a witness to David himself, to show, hey, this is what can happen if you have God with you and then you reject God. So there's a lot of potential lessons that you can pull from the story of Saul and David and Samuel and Eli. There's so many things that you can look at and say, hey, maybe it was like this, or did David use this as a witness? Why, when God said, hey, the crown will never depart from Judah, was the first king a Benjaminite? it opens the door to so much further study. And I'm so glad that the question was asked, that we could dive in and study this matter further and hopefully clearly explain why it was 20 years, how we know it was 20 years, give a little bit more of a perspective from the Bible about establishing the timeline and answering some questions about, how things can be misunderstood, or you can see examples of tradition coming through even with the apostles and people like Paul, where there's room for not necessarily error, but we can read about Peter. Peter was saying one thing with one group of people and another thing with another group, and Paul had to go and correct him. So, lesson: nobody is perfect. Absolutely not. The minute we start thinking that we are perfect and we have no room for growth, that's when we should be hitting our knees, because that's probably when we need growth the most. But glad that this question was brought up. Hopefully that is a satisfactory answer. But if there's any further questions about this topic or other topics, this is a live program right now. If you want to drop those questions in the chat box, we can get those answered tonight. If you have a question after the program is live, drop it in the comments section of this video. You can also email us on our email. Go to our website, diggingyourbible.com. There is a place where you can drop a message to us there, or you can use any of our socials. So be sure to check us out. If there are any questions for this evening, now is the time to drop them in the chat box. We do have a little bit of time left for this evening. I know it was a lot to cover, and if there's any questions about the math, or you'd like to have it further explained, please do let me know. I do highly recommend going back. I will categorize this video and timestamp it so that you can go to the description and go to the specific areas in the video where it has the verses for the name of the city that's being tracked, and some of the where we're talking about the math portion and figuring out the math and how old David was during particular points of history through his life. Okay, so we do have a question that did pop up here. So it says, about how long did Saul actually rule? So if we're looking at the 20-year time frame for the Ark of the Covenant, if the people said, hey, we want a king, and we want a king right now from when the Ark of the Covenant came back. So we're going to go from when the Ark of the Covenant came back. We're not going to consider that 7 months that it was with the Philistines. We know that King David was king at Hebron for 7.5 years. So we're going to take that 20. We are going to subtract 7.5 years from that. So we know that from when the Ark of the Covenant was placed at the house of Abinadab to the time when King Saul died and David became king was 12.5 years. So we know that at the most, King Saul ruled for 12.5 years. It's implied in Samuel that it was during the time frame of his 3rd year of rule that he displeased God and failed in his mission. God gave him a second chance, and he did not take that second chance. And it was during that time frame, which appears to have been during the 3rd year of his rule, when David was then anointed as king. But it was at most King Saul ruled for 12.5 years, going with the idea that David decided to bring the ark to Jerusalem as soon as he captured it, and that King Saul was made king as soon as they got the ark back in their possession. So a maximum time frame of 12 and a half years, but in total, we really don't know exactly how long King Saul did rule. Yes, we don't know where it was. It could have been more than how long. Yeah, we don't know exactly how long King Saul ruled. So by following the Ark of the Covenant travels, that's how we know for sure that Saul didn't rule for 42 years or for 40 years. Correct. And we know that Saul wasn't a young man, one, because of that verse, but two, because one of his sons who actually survived the slaughter of Saul and Jonathan, the reason that David didn't rule all of Israel was because one of Saul's sons ruled for 7.5 years at the same time David was ruling. And when that son began to rule, he was 40 years old. So we know that Saul was potentially in his 40s or 50s when he began to be king. And a lot of people say, oh, but he was looking after his father's donkeys. Well, if his father was still alive, that was Jewish culture, is if the father was still alive, it didn't matter how old you were. You could have been 75 years old. If your dad was still alive, your dad was considered the patriarch of the family, and you obeyed him and did what he said. It didn't matter if you were the eldest son or the youngest son. And the donkeys that he was going to find, it's theorized that these were potentially very important donkeys because the heads of cities would ride on donkeys, almost like royalty. And one of the things that is open for additional study or thought is the fact that these particular donkeys may have been their special breeding animals, because this location where Saul lived was one of the locations where these donkeys that were for the heads of state or the judges at the time would get their animals from. And that Saul was actually raising the animals for the heads of state, and he became the head of state. So that's one of the ideas behind there. But it wouldn't have mattered how old Saul was. He still would have been obeying his father, and he still would have been, taking care of the animals and trying to track what happened to these animals, particularly if these were the special breeding donkeys for the judges of the nearby cities that were going, that he needed to definitely find, because that would have been their livelihood. Do we have any other questions for this evening? We've got about 2 minutes left before we go ahead and end for tonight. So if you want to get your questions in, then now is the time. I do like looking at all of the different places that are mentioned in the Bible and just trying to keep track of where all of these different locations are, or the variation on the names. That is such a big help when you're researching, is to actually, if you want to find a location or an individual, start looking at the names. Track the names, and the names, you're going to see variations that you didn't even think existed. And there's also a big difference sometimes in the names as they're recorded in the Old Testament versus the New Testament, or they're recording from, say, the books of Kings to the books of Chronicles. There is a difference, and most likely that's because the books of Kings were written either before or shortly after King Nebuchadnezzar came in. They might be a summary. Some have suggested that they were a summary that was being continued right up until the time of Jeremiah, and that Jeremiah is the one that either wrote them or had them written, whereas the books of Chronicles are the works of Ezra, because the very end of Second Chronicles almost perfectly and identically matches up with the beginning of the book of Ezra. So some have suggested that Ezra was the one that was in charge of writing the books of Chronicles, because this was the people that were coming back from the captivity. They were taking back charge of the cities, and they needed that additional framework of, hey, here's where we went wrong. Let's make sure we don't repeat history. Whereas the books of Kings were either already written or made sure that they were preserved because of Jeremiah and Jeremiah's servant, and that they were to verify that the history was maintained through the captivity, so that if individuals wanted to know, how did we end up here and what's going to happen and how do we get out of this, they would have that information. And when you have the two together, it's the word of two witnesses, because they complement each other. So the background story on the donkeys helps us understand the culture and what was going on at that time. Thank you for that. You are welcome, Heaven Soon. Glad I could provide a little bit of insight there. Nobody ever thinks about those poor little donkeys that were missing. They're just a plot point to keep the story moving, and there's actually sometimes a greater significance to what is going on behind the story. It's not just, hey, he went looking for some lost farmyard animals, but hey, there was actually a lot more significance to the type of barnyard animal that was being looked at, and this is why that this was significant, and why it's significant that Jesus would have been led into the city on this animal. So yes, there's a lot of background that's important to just study a little further. I mean, you don't have to have that background to understand the gist of the story, but sometimes it is helpful if you want to dig in just a little bit more and say, hey, you know what? I've read this story 4 or 5 times. I don't need to look at it any further. There's always a new piece of information to glean. Every time you're reading, there's always something new, and that's why I find studying so interesting. Yes, the Old Testament gives at least 2 eyewitness accounts, just like the apostles are several eyewitness accounts. And there's a lot that's written in the New Testament that can also be found in the Old Testament. So there's the backup of the Old Testament, the New Testament, authors agreeing with one another. And this is actually how they would determine which books are we actually going to put into our Bibles? Does another book of the Bible reference this book of the Bible, and do the messages agree with one another? Do they contradict one another? And so they would actually use that in the content of the books to verify the authenticity and the reliability of the different books. Yeah, take the account closest to the event because it would be more accurate, more firsthand account. Yes, that is sometimes very helpful to take the account that is closest, and that would be the most reliable. Not always, because in the case of, like, Josephus, he can't get facts straight about Herod. So there are some times when looking at a subject, you have to look at all of their writings. Is this a reliable person all around? When do they stop being reliable? And then also, if they've been reliable on these other topics, why did they cease being reliable? Or is it just our understanding that has changed? And that has happened a lot, where historians have said, well, things like the Hittites. Nobody thought that the Hittites existed because they could not find them anywhere. There was no records, and the Bible was the only place. So the books of the Bible must not be accurate. And come to find out that actually the Bible was the most accurate. And that's happened on several various occasions where that has been the case. And yes, the Bible is his story. History is all about Jesus, all about God. So thank you for sticking around with me this evening. We're going to go ahead and conclude for this evening, conclude the live stream. If you have any questions afterwards, any comments, we love hearing from everybody. So please, comments box, ping us with a message, ping our social media. We love hearing. Everybody, just have a great weekend and God be with you.